Hello and welcome to the Corney Barrow podcast. Will Hargrove. I'm joined here by Guy Seddon.
Hello, Will.
Good. Hello, indeed. Yeah, very much so. And we've actually it's just a duo today. Mr. Muller, despite his German roots, is not actually joining us for our podcast about what has become a bit of a traditional two-man trip for the summer. So, Guy, take us away. What did we get up to?
Yeah, thanks, Will. Well, this is a fun one, and it's a trip which is sort of once a year. And, whereas we go quite often to France, for Germany, it really is just a sort of annual pilgrimage, as it were. And it tends to happen in the summer months, as you say, which makes it that bit more enjoyable, just because we tend to have a bit of sunshine. And it's an in and out of two different airports. So we did it the traditional way this year, which is to go from London into Luxembourg. From Luxembourg, it's a short hop to the Mosel. So we did our two producer relationships in the Mosel before driving down to Pfalz and then flying out the next day from Frankfurt. So it sort of takes in a fair bit of German countryside and a bit of driving in between. But it's a really enjoyable one and sort of one that we've done for a few years now, haven't we? And it's always good to catch up with people.
I think it's quite nice as well to see people when they're probably not receiving masses of visitors. I know obviously you do Burgundy a lot in October, November, and much as we work exclusively with people, they're still seeing their importers from all the different markets. So I feel we get a nice bit of extra time with Christina and Katerina and Sophie and Stefan.
Yeah, I agree. As you just mentioned, our first stop was Thanisch. So what we do is we sort of make a beeline from the airport, and Christelle, our sort of mastermind with the timetables and everything, is always pretty much spot on in terms of how long it takes us to drive, which always astounds me that we effectively get there just about on time. And we went straight into a tasting of the 2024 vintage Rieslings from Thanisch.
What were you expecting before we started to taste, though? I mean,
yeah, that's a good question because 24. In terms of the calendar, obviously the releases go Bordeaux, then Burgundy, and then you start to get sort of glimpses of Germany and Spain and Italy and other bits and pieces. So the definition of the sort of reputation of the vintage is very much set by what happens in France, I think, in the minds of our customers. And for that reason, 24, was a fairly embattled, tricky growing season in Bordeaux in particular.
Yeah.
And so I think, you can't help but to have a little bit of that in the back of your mind and to think, well, it was tricky in Bordeaux and it was tricky in bits of Burgundy as well. I'm thinking especially of the sort of, Pinot Noir and the Côte de Nuit, which we'll come on to in a different podcast. So I was expecting a more challenging set of wines, I suppose you would say. And I don't think that's unfair when you talk about Germany in 24. I think there were certain challenges around the growing season.
Yep.
And I think the frost, which happened in spring 24, was really the thing that set the tone for the growing season. But, without getting into all of it right now, I think in essence, there are some beautiful wines from 24 in Riesling. And I think what we saw at Thanisch, this first tasting that we did, was that it really tends towards the lower must-wait end of the spectrum, by which I mean the Cabinets and the Spätlesen. And so, that Thanisch haven't made any Auslese in 24, which is an unusual decision and a bold decision, I suppose. But something which is commendable when they feel that their strength lies in the lower level of the predicate system. Then that's what they've gone for, and that's what they've majored in. Whereas with Prüm, they actually have made the full range, haven't they?
Yeah, exactly. Which I think caught us slightly by surprise. But it was. Yeah, I was just looking at some of my notes, and from Christina at Thanisch, classic Mosel vintage, straight, clear, and elegant, more comparable with 21, needing time, and I think that was something that we'll probably touch on a little bit. But what were once we actually started tasting, what were your observations?
Yeah, so. This sort of lazy wine merchant's way of approaching a vintage, I suppose, is to latch onto something which might be a comparison vintage when you start tasting. And I think the vintage I had in the back of my mind as a comparison was maybe 21, just because we've seen this kind of bifurcated sort of personality of vintages recently. And, you've got the likes of 18 and 22 and 23, which were pretty
Yeah.
warm.
Yeah.
And then you've also, on the total flip side, got the likes of 21, and I think 24 roughly fits into this, which is a much cooler vintage and something with a bit of frost and something where you're sort of fighting against that cooler Mother Nature elements in the season.
That's fair.
And so, the one thing personality-wise that really came out, and especially in Thanisch, I think, was the acidity. It's got this beautiful, crisp backbone of acidity to the wines. And that, I think, doesn't make them the easiest wines to taste up front. So, I mean, by the time they make their way to customers, it'll be fine.
Yeah.
But when you're tasting at this very early stage, and, in some cases, they'd only just been bottled or some of them hadn't been bottled yet.
It was a mix, wasn't it? Yeah, it was
a
half
mix.
and half with Thanisch. Yeah.
And so in that sense, the acidity is really bright, and it's sort of it's really the first thing that you notice about the 24s, I would say.
Yeah. But I mean, this is a part of the world where you go to for that bracing acidity, if you like,
absolutely,
for that properness. And so I mean, I thought much as we didn't, as you say, get up to sort of Auslese and things, I was impressed with the range at Thanisch, and I felt they had the sort of Thanisch DNA stamp on them, particularly when we got up towards the Doctor wines, which I don't think is any great surprise. One of the Bernkastler Doctor being one of the great vineyards of, well, Europe, let alone Germany. So yeah, I mean, it was a really good tasting though, I thought. And I do think that, as you mentioned, you allude to sort of the vintages like 18 and 22 and 23 will probably drink first or will have more to offer earlier. But there's a real classic, and I mean classic in a positive sense, real classic kick to these,
I agree.
real focus.
I jotted down a few things as we were tasting that Christina Thanisch, who is, the new generation of the family, which is great to be tasting with her. And, some of her comments, she did mention the words of a really classic Mosel vintage, which, we try to steer away from the word classic just because it can be so many things to so many different people. But I think that's a good encapsulation of it. And she then said comparable to the 80s and 90s, so I mean, you're almost harking back to this previous style of wine, I think, in the Mosel, which is something which is really nice to see. And the GGs, the sort of bone dry wines that they make, averaged 11.8% alcohol, which is really, really nice and fresh. And
absolutely,
So
I totally agree with that. I mean, it was really interesting to taste them. The Cuvée Christina is something that's come out again with the Bernkastel Lay and a Cabernet this year, which sometimes it can be a Spate Laser and things. So no, it was fascinating. And also just talking to Christina about, the distribution they've had there, because we've worked with these wines, the Thanisch wines, since 16, I think I'm right.
Yes.
In the 80s, it's what reminded me, you mentioning sort of 80s and 90s, but in the 80s, they were selling 90% of their production to the States. Which is, very different from the 30 or 40 they do now. But it's fascinating. It's always feel I learned something coming away from Thanisch. And we certainly also, it's worth mentioning, I think, the 24s, which we loved, but we also got to try 17 and 19 from the Doctor with Christina. And then she rather craftily blind tasted us on the Doctor Auslese 90. And for those that are really into their German wines, I have to say, I sort of preface this by saying that I found it incredibly difficult doing blind tastings of the German wines, but particularly in the Mosel, because where do you go first? Do you go for age first, or do you go for the Pradigat, the must wait thing first? And so I think we were sort of wrong for the right reasons, rather.
I think I got there in a fairly roundabout. Well, no, I think I got it wrong in a fairly roundabout way. I think I
but it's a wonderful wine, and almost getting. And I think this is something people sometimes miss by not aging these wines. The wines become drier. I mean, essentially, they sort of combine into this drier soul. They still have a lusciousness, but some of what people would see as sweetness becomes texture and sort of lushness. That's just wonderful.
And we sort of it's worth spending a little time discussing this concept of sweetness as well, because it's sort of almost perceived as the wrong terminology in the Mosel, and I wonder sometimes if it's because people don't like talking about sweetness and sugar, but actually when you taste the wines and you really feel that the sugar content just adds kind of richness and body to the wine more than giving a sort of perception of sweetness. So especially in these real high acid vintages like 24, I think the fact that you've got some balancing sugar there just serves to kind of make the whole
Oh well, I agree
profile more
100%.
balanced. It's
Yeah,
yeah.
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 No, I think, and then after a splendid but probably quite wisely slightly light lunch, which was a good idea because I was going to be falling asleep at the wheel and falling asleep at tastings, but we were very well looked after by Christina and Hans. We then made the 15-minute drive quickly up to Velen to see Katerina at Prüm. And as you say, a fuller range. So what was your sort of takeaway from Prüm?
Yeah, well, I mean, tasting at Prüm is always an absolute pleasure. And the fact that you can sit in Katarina's dining room essentially and look out at Velena Sonnino,
Yeah, it's quite something. Yeah,
this great vineyard right opposite the house is pretty awesome. And you can really imagine where these wines came from. JJ Prüm, as I'm sure our listeners will know, is one of the great names in the Mosel. 13.5 hectares of vineyards. Centered around the village of Velem, which is where the estate house, the family house is, but stretching both north and south. So north up to Grach and Zelting and Sonnino, and then down the other way towards Badstuber, towards the village or the town of Bernkastel, which is where Thanisch is located. The takeaway from this tasting for me was that yes, you get this bright perception of acidity that we'd seen at Tarnish, but it was balanced by the most beautiful kind of textured fruit. And, in places, some real kind of layered yellow stone fruit character, which
yeah,
just goes
agreed. Yeah.
beautifully against this brightness of acidity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought it was cracking. And it was brilliant to hear that. I think next year we're going to try and put a little bit more time aside and actually go to the vineyard with Katerina, which I think we've gone up there and had a bit of a nose around, but it'd be much better with a proper tour guide
Yeah.
to do that. And I think that's one of the things. I mean, this trip's great that we do this sort of one day out and one day back sort of trip, but it's great to get amongst to get amongst the vines and things there. I was fascinated also by, and it's a little bit of a sort of digression, but the AI experiment she was talking about in terms of pruning. I mean, which goes to show that, everyone, however traditional someone might be seen to be, and I think Prüm is by dint of being one of the sort of establishment figures, if you like, and a real upholder of quality, that they're looking at something like that. It's just fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It is. I jotted down a few things which may or may not make it into our final offer, but just sort of for interest and sort of a bit of insider kind of insight into what we discuss about these things. We discussed a little bit about sorting, which I found to be quite interesting. And they sort essentially twice in the fields, so in the vineyard, and then when the grapes make it to the tractor, as she described it, so they do a sort of double sorting before the grapes make it back to the winery.
Yeah.
And then for the gold caps and the Beerenauslesen and the Trockenbeerenauslesen, the BA and the TBA, they do a further sorting at the winery, sort of on a proper table.
Yeah. I mean, then you're into sort of, literally grape by grape, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. But I found that sort of logistic thing quite interesting.
Yeah.
And she talked about bottling as well. They tend to bottle in two phases. And most of that is driven by logistics. But one interesting comment, which I hadn't really thought about before, is that once they bottle, because the Prüm wines are packed horizontally in cases, they leave the bottles upright after bottling for the corks to fix. And that's just a sort of real detail point.
Yeah.
It gives an insight into how minute the detail and the sort of attention to detail is here.
Yeah. I think the idea being that when they're lying down, obviously the pressure is different around the cork. It's stood up, it's equal, and the cork's allowed to expand. Yeah, no, agreed. No, I'm sure that's in the margins of my dreadful handwriting somewhere. But no, brilliant to see Katrina, and also for us both to meet her father Manfred on the way out. Still going strong into his ninth decade, but that was quite special, really quite special. But then we did the drive. I think we tossed the coin, and I did it this year. But it's a pretty pleasant one. Straight down to the Pfalz.
Yep, exactly. I must have been because I was the passenger, but it seemed to pass quite quickly that drive, and we had fairly decent weather for it, didn't we? So it was a bit of a mixture of sort of sunshine and a few spots of rain, but we did okay, and got down to the town of Neustadt, which is where we stayed overnight in our sort of habitual hotel there, which
absolutely.
which is absolutely fine. And we had a very quick turnaround, sort of literally 10 minutes to drop off bags, and then Stefan Christmann very kindly came and picked us up and chauffeured us to dinner in his very smart 100% electric BMW.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So no, we were well looked after, as you say. I mean, it's and Sophie, I think, was off pouring at an event, but we saw it the next morning, obviously. But Stefan, I think, is so fascinating because he, for listeners who might not know, has been president of the VDP for 11, 12, 13 years now. But also is, the name ahead above the door at Christmann with the help of Sophie, his daughter, who's more and more involved and taking on the Pinot project, which we'll come on to. But yeah, we got through quite a lot of politics. We got through quite a lot of German wine laws and rules, and yeah, all sorts of topics over a long but very fun dinner where we had some aged Riesling, obviously of his, which is cracking, and the 19 Idig Spätburgunder, which is just starting to really strut its stuff. But I mean, we'll come on to the 23s that we were actually tasting there, didn't we?
Yeah. No, it's one of these things that, you can taste wine. Well, it's hard to taste wine remotely, but it can be done, as we saw from the COVID period, and you can, develop and sustain relationships remotely as well. But I think actually spending time with somebody and, going out for dinner with them, it's a level of communication that you wouldn't be able to have if you didn't actually go there and do that work of visiting. So it was an absolute pleasure, to be honest. And yeah, you're quite right. We did speak about quite a lot of politics during our 48 hours in Germany.
We did, yeah.
We did our best at one point to steer the conversation away from it.
I tried, but it wasn't happening, was it? No. We were pulled back onto the straight and narrow, or the opposite. But yeah, so then the following morning, obviously after a decent rest, we made our way to Christmann and tasted with both Stefan and Sophie. So yeah, what were your sort of takeaways from that? Because obviously we were 24 Riesling again, but we were 23 Spätburgunder, although it'll be 22 Spätburgunder that we're offering come the autumn time.
Yes,
so
that's right.
I mean, and the sparklings in between.
Well, should we start with the 24 Riesling?
Yeah,
and take it from there. I mean, I always ask for a little sort of précis of the season before we start tasting, just because even though we get a written vintage report from most people, and especially Christmann, who are very organized, it's actually quite revealing sometimes to hear somebody speaking about the season.
100%, yeah.
And so the comments we tasted with both Sophie and Stefan, and the comment one of them made was, for sure it was a wet season. So this was sort of point number one. But from the end of 2023's harvest to the end of 24's harvest, twice as much rain as usual fell. So I mean, that's a huge difference to average, which sort of sets the scene. And Stefan, who I don't know how many vintages he now has under his belt, but I mean it's a fair few.
Yeah.
Said that for the first time in his life, they had to spray by night. They didn't have
that's right.
They didn't have time for spraying in the daytime because there was so much other stuff to be doing in the vineyards. So it sets the scene for a very labor-intensive season.
Yeah.
And one in which you really had to be on your toes. It was a colder year. I remember Stefan making this point and saying, unlike some seasons, which are, sort of saved by bursts of heat, there weren't really any hot periods in 24. So, this is a very old school style growing season, but it's ended up being what they called a very nicely balanced year. And I think that, showed out in our tasting, but it definitely is a vintage of equilibrium and a lovely balance.
Yeah, I had straightness and structure written down as a quote as well for the Rieslings, which must have come from Stefan. But it's also interesting to know they're all 12% on the alcohol side. I find it tedious to talk about alcohol, but I think it's important to, because it is a topic. And below 2 grams of sugar, so basically the Rieslings are
totally dry. Yeah.
I mean that's a negligible, almost irrelevant sort of number, if you like.
Yeah. So I mean, I thought the Rieslings were beautiful here, and again, you see that sort of real brightness and briskness of acidity. But that's something that I think the 24s are going to make for some really long aging Rieslings, and that's
Yeah.
exciting because they're proper, age-worthy wines. And I think we will be drinking the 22s and the 23s, a fair way before the 24s.
Yeah, the
Perhaps.
22s are actually gorgeous that I've had
Yeah,
recently
they are.
on the Rieslings. It's interesting that because they travel a lot, and as does Katerina and Christina as well up in the Mosel, but because the Christmas travel a lot, they use a lot of analogies to other wines. So they were sort of calling the Gimmelding and Kapellenberg 24, sort of saying, "Oh, this is the coolest vineyard. This is our Chablis."
Yeah.
Which I thought was very interesting. And there were lots, and amongst the Pinots, there were also fascinating sort of comparisons. But they really do, you get a sense, because they're in and amongst the vineyards the entire time, as those in the Mosel are and in Burgundy, that there's a sort of personality taken on
Yeah, exactly.
by them. So I thought that was it was fascinating.
Exactly. And then moving to the Pinots, so we tasted the 23 vintage. We tasted the 22 vintage this time last year. It's actually the 22 Spätburgunders Pinots that we're going to be offering. So does it make sense to do a quick rundown of both years, maybe?
Yep, yeah, absolutely.
Just for interest. So 22, Stefan Reinhardt, who writes for the Robert Parker site, called it the best vintage for German Pinot Noir ever, apparently. So that's quite an endorsement.
Not holding back.
I mean, it was a warm, ripe growing season for Pinot. Lovely Pinot growing conditions, basically. And I think whilst there are certain similarities between 22 and 23, the one thing which was an interesting comment while we were tasting the 23s, which perhaps differentiates them, is that it started raining at the beginning of August in 23, and apparently didn't stop all the way through to harvest. So I mean, that hasn't resulted in any sort of perceptible dilution or anything, as far as I can see. But I think perhaps it plays a part in the profile of the wines. The 22s certainly are beautiful wines, and I mean, I'm very excited that we're going to be offering 22 Pinot alongside 24 Riesling this year, because I mean, you couldn't get more sort of two more different vintages, and I think
no, you're right.
One is warm and demonstrative and just beautifully proportioned, and the other is sort of majestically crisp and almost kind of regally slow aging. I think it will be so. So they will go together, quite nicely in a sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought it was fascinating. I love the way the Pinots go, or the Spätburgunders go sort of up through the gears. And it's not to say that, I mean, I've got some of the 17 and 18, Osdenlagen at home at the moment. I'm loving it, but it's fascinating to see the sort of village to Premier to Grand Cru as you go through the Erste to the GGs. And the first time we've tasted with the 23 Shield, the first time that we've had that added to the sort of GG range. So there's now a triumvirate.
Yeah, exactly.
The Shield child with an S in front, which is to do with the fact that the vineyard is actually a shield shape. But but I think that the wines are really coming on and on and on.
Yeah. So I mean, 23 is Sophie Christmann's 7th vintage making the Pinots.
That's right.
And I think it's fair to say that it was a bit of an adjunct when they started the Pinot project, maybe. And they were historically an estate which was all about Riesling, and Pinot is a newer string to their bow, but it's one that, I mean, we have people who exclusively buy the Pinots in some cases, or who fell in love with the estate via the Pinots, and I think it's become central to what they do in a way that perhaps they hadn't quite envisaged 7 years ago.
No, I think they were saying it's around about 30% of the they're about 20% whole bunch across the range on the Pinots, but also it's a significant part of the production, about a third, I think.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
It's
no, I mean, it's an absolute pleasure to taste those Pinots, and we do them. We tested them after the Rieslings, didn't we?
Yes,
we did.
Yeah. Well, and with the sparklings in the middle, which we can sort of maybe finish off on. But I mean, it was a cracking tasting.
And what is very interesting, I find, and across the sort of Riesling and Pinot Noir, and to a certain extent some of the sparklings as well, you can see the kind of terroir or the vineyard characters coming out
Yeah.
via the different expressions, which is brilliant, and it shows you that Idig, for example, from which a red and a white are made, a Pinot and a
Mm.
Riesling.
It's interesting. Yeah, one place where I find I get that, but not in as extreme because it's two different reds. But with Roberto Conterno's wines, and people will be sort of groaning and saying I'm sort of predictably mentioning them, but the Barbera and the Nebbiolo, which are okay, they're both red, but they're about as different as you can get in red, grape varieties, show the difference between Chiretta and Francia so clearly. And I completely agree with what you're saying that
Yeah.
the vineyards come out across both the Riesling and Pinots.
Absolutely. I thought we might get through a podcast without Mr. Hargrove mentioning.
Well, no.
Concerno, but
Well, Mr. Muller's not here to slap my wrist.
well, in that case, I'll give another example from Burgundy, which is the Musigny from de Vogüé, which I think the white and the red Musigny. I do think you get that sort of chalky mineral definition of Musigny coming out via both varieties, and so I think that the same holds true in Pfalz and for the Grand Crus in particular from Christmann.
Yeah.
So what about the sparklings?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the fact that we had the 19 the night before with Stefan, I think was fascinating. So this is a sect project, Christmann and Kaufmann, Mathieu Kaufmann coming from having worked at Bollinger and then Von Buell. And so he obviously brings the sort of sparkling expertise, but both Sophie and Stefan and the rest of the family have loved their champagne and sparkling wines, although they're not trying to mimic champagne here, which I think is important, but through two different ranges, through the 101, 102, 103, which is a sort of cuvee base, that's the Riesling, and then the 201, 203, 204, which is the sort of Spätburgunder, even a little bit of sort of Chardonnay and things in there. It's fascinating to see the difference between a Riesling sparkling and a more conventional grape variety sparkling when everything else is exactly the same.
Yeah.
And then the single vineyards, which will come on. But
I mean, it's amazing to create this sort of very high quality set of sparkling wines from scratch. And a lot of the holdings were from the original Christmann estate.
Yep.
So they've identified plots which should go into sparkling rather than still from creation of this project onwards. And other than Mathieu Kaufmann's, he's one of the great men in the world of sparkling wine, of champagne, via his time as cellar master of Bollinger. But the fact that he's gone to Germany and done something totally unique, I think, is incredible, really. And in Germany, the reputation has built via the renown of the Christmann estate for the Rieslings and the Pinots, but B, they did a very clever thing, which was to get sommeliers at top restaurants in Germany on board by essentially saying to them, look, here are a few bottles of our inaugural vintage of this sparkling project. We want you to just introduce them gently to your top customers. And, in some cases without payment. I think, it was a sort of, this is something that we believe in, that we think you should evangelize about, and go off and communicate and see if you like them as much as we do, and go off and tell the story. And I think within a relatively short period of years, I mean, the reputation has got to a great point in Germany, and we can't wait to do the same thing in the UK now.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I mean, I think, and whilst it's never going to be vast, I think it's a fascinating thing to see. And I noticed a friend of the podcast, Mr. Eccles, when him and Tiff moved house recently, I think they toasted that with one of the Christmann and Kaufmann
excellent
wines. So that's quite a high bar to pass muster there. But yeah, no, a really, really, really good trip. And I think we sort of reflected that it'd be great to get a few more of the team out to see the vineyards here, because I think in both the Mosel, which is clearly one of the most striking, sort of along with maybe the Douro and Piedmont and Burgundy and things, one of the most strikingly beautiful wine regions. Down in the Pfalz, where it's a little bit more Burgundian in style, I think you get a real sense for the place.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're not actually far from the French border there, so it's you can you can see the coming together of these two great winemaking cultures. Yeah, no, I totally agree. I mean, it would be great to get more people to go there and see it. And as with most wine regions, you really need to pace around, or at least drive around and see how things fit together.
Yeah, quite a lot of cycling going on there, wasn't there, as well? So I think that by doing it by bike, you sort of get somewhere fast enough to enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's a good whistle-stop tour through Germany and our three wonderful producers there. I will sign off by saying it's been a pleasure to share the podcast with you, Mr. Hargrove. So goodbye from me.
Mr. Seddon, the pleasure is all mine. So goodbye from me.